What if I told you that most of your life, the forgotten memories, the days you can't recall, the moments that slipped away, are still shaping who you are right now? That's the strange mystery of the paradox of the forgotten past. And today, we're going to uncover why what you forget may matter just as much as what you remember. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to share this video with someone who loves exploring life's deepest paradoxes. The Ship of Theseus Paradox. Imagine standing at the harbor, watching an ancient ship return from a long voyage. This ship has carried generations of sailors, faced countless storms, and crossed endless seas. But as the years go by, its wooden planks begin to rot, its sails tear, and its parts wear down. One by one, each piece of the ship is replaced. First a plank here, then a mast there, then the deck, and eventually even the anchor. Decades later, not a single original piece remains. Yet the ship still stands in the harbor, carrying the same name. The Ship of Theseus. But here lies the puzzle. If none of its original parts are left, can we truly say it is still the same ship? Or has it become something entirely new? The paradox becomes even more thought-provoking when we imagine a second twist. What if someone carefully collected all the discarded pieces, every old plank, every broken mast, every weathered nail, and used them to rebuild the ship, exactly as it once was? Now we are faced with two ships. One is built entirely from the original materials, while the other has carried on the journey, the legacy, and the name of Theseus across the oceans. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? The one of history, made of the same matter, or the one of continuity that never stopped sailing? This paradox is not just about a ship. It's about the very nature of identity. What does it mean for something, or someone, to remain the same over time? Is identity tied to the physical material? If so, then the ship made of the old planks should be the real one. Or is identity tied to continuity, to the ongoing story, the lived experience, the function it serves? If so, then the ship that kept sailing, even with new parts, holds the true essence. When you reflect deeper, this puzzle applies to us as human beings. The cells in our bodies are constantly dying and regenerating. In fact, scientists tell us that almost every cell in our body is replaced over the span of a few years. That means the physical you of today is not made of the same material as the you of your childhood. So, are you still the same person you once were? Or are you a completely different being that just happens to carry the same name and memories? The paradox doesn't stop at biology. It extends into psychology and philosophy. Our thoughts, beliefs, and even personalities change with time. Who you were 10 years ago may feel like a stranger compared to who you are now. Yet, you still consider yourself the same self. Why? Perhaps it is because identity is not about the material or even the changing mind, but about the story we tell ourselves, the narrative that ties all versions of us together into one continuous thread. This is why the Ship of Theseus paradox has fascinated philosophers for centuries. It forces us to ask, what truly defines identity? Is it matter, memory, continuity, or something deeper that cannot be touched or replaced? Maybe the truth is that identity isn't fixed. It's fluid, like the sea itself. A ship sails not because of its planks, but because of its purpose and journey. And maybe we too are not defined by what changes in us, but by the ongoing voyage of our existence. The paradox doesn't give a final answer, and maybe that is its power. It shows us that life, like the Ship of Theseus, is never static. We are constantly being rebuilt, constantly changing, and yet somehow we remain us. Perhaps identity is not about being one thing forever, but about being a river that flows, always moving, always changing, yet always itself. And just like the ship, we continue our journey, piece by piece, story by story, becoming and remaining ourselves all at once. The liar paradox. Picture this. Someone looks you in the eye and says, "I am lying." Immediately your mind starts to turn. If the person is telling the truth, then they are lying, which would make their statement false. But if they are lying, then their statement is actually true, because they admitted they were lying. The moment you try to pin it down, the logic slips away. This is the essence of the liar paradox, a puzzle so simple in words, yet so endlessly frustrating in meaning. At first, it seems like just a clever word trick. But the liar paradox reveals something much deeper about the limits of logic, language, and truth itself. We like to think that truth and falsehood are simple opposites. Something is either true or it is false. But this paradox shows us that sometimes words can create a loop that destroys that neat division. The sentence, "I am lying," feeds back into itself, creating an endless cycle with no way out. Philosophers and logicians have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. In ancient Greece, the thinker Epimenides famously declared, "All Cretans are liars." Since he himself was a Cretan, his statement undermined itself. Was he telling the truth, or was he lying? Later, philosophers expanded on this, calling it the Epimenides Paradox, which is one of the earliest recorded versions of the liar problem. What starts as a playful puzzle becomes a doorway into questioning how language and truth really work. The paradox matters because it exposes cracks in the very systems we use to understand the world. Language is supposed to describe reality, but when words describe themselves, they sometimes collapse into contradictions. The liar paradox is like a mirror reflecting itself over and over. There's no bottom, no final image, just infinite regress. If even one small sentence can destabilize logic, what does that say about our ability to fully capture with truth through language? Now think about how this applies to everyday life. People sometimes say contradictory things, not just in riddles, but in real emotions and actions. A person might say, "I don't care about what you think," yet they are saying it precisely because they do care. Someone might insist, "I'm an honest person," while lying in the same breath. The liar paradox is not only a logical puzzle. It reflects human behavior, where words can be masks, half-truths, or traps. In modern times, the liar paradox has also influenced mathematics and computer science. The famous logician Kurt Gödel used a similar idea in his incompleteness theorems, proving that in any system of logic, there will always be statements that cannot be proven true or false. His discovery shook the foundation of mathematics, showing that truth is not always absolute, but sometimes undecidable. In other words, the liar paradox isn't just a game. It revealed limits to human knowledge itself. So, what do we do with this paradox? Some say we should create new categories beyond just true or false. Maybe some statements are undefined or self-referential. Others argue that the paradox shows us the limitations of human reasoning, reminding us that not everything can fit neatly into boxes. Whatever the solution may be, the liar paradox remains one of the most haunting puzzles in philosophy, because it doesn't just challenge logic, it challenges our trust in language, in meaning, and even in the possibility of absolute truth. Perhaps that is why the liar paradox has endured for so long. It is simple enough for a child to understand, yet deep enough to trouble the greatest philosophers. It reminds us that truth is not always straightforward, and sometimes the more we try to chase certainty, the more it escapes us. In the end, the paradox forces us to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, teaching us that language, like life itself, is full of twists that may never fully resolve. The paradox of the self. Every night you go to sleep, and every morning you wake up. It feels natural to assume that the person who opens their eyes in the morning is the same person who closed them the night before. But is that really true? The paradox of the self asks us to question whether the you of yesterday is really the same as the you of today. On the surface, it seems obvious. Of course, you are the same person. You have the same name, you remember your past, and you continue your life where you left off. But if you look more closely, things are not so simple. Your body and brain are always changing. Cells in your body die and are replaced. Your brain forms and loses connections while you sleep. Even your memories shift slightly each time you recall them. So, if the physical and mental parts of you are always changing, what makes you the same person across time? One answer is continuity of memory. Many people believe you are the same because you remember your past experiences. Memory creates a thread that ties together different versions of you into one story. But memory is not perfect. It fades, it changes, and sometimes it invents details that never happened. If memory can be unreliable, can it really serve as the foundation of identity? Another answer is the continuity of your body. Even though your cells renew, your body moves through the world as one physical being. You eat, breathe, and grow. But even this view has problems. Over time, almost all the atoms in your body are replaced. If the material constantly changes, what exactly is it that remains? Some philosophers and religions suggest there is no fixed self at all. In Buddhism, for example, the idea of anatta or no self teaches that what you think of as you is actually just a collection of changing processes, thoughts, feelings, and physical states, without a permanent center. From this perspective, clinging to the idea of a solid, unchanging identity only causes suffering because it is holding on to something that does not exist. But even if the self is an illusion, it is still a useful one. Without a sense of self, it would be hard to make decisions, form goals, or build relationships. Your identity helps you navigate life, even if it is constantly shifting. In a way, the self might be more like a story than an object. It is rewritten every day, edited by new experiences, but it still feels like one continuous narrative. So, are you the same person who went to sleep last night? The answer depends on how you define identity. If you think identity means a fixed, unchanging core, then the paradox shows that such a thing may not exist. But if you see identity as a process, then you are still you, because you is not a single permanent thing. It is an ongoing flow. The paradox of the self reminds us that we are not frozen in time. We are rivers, not statues. Every day we change a little, but the flow continues. Instead of asking, "Am I the same?" maybe the more important question is, "How am I changing?" Because in the end, the self is not a destination, it is a journey. The paradox of the forgotten dream. Think about the last time you had a vivid dream. Maybe you were running through a strange city, flying across the sky, or even living an entirely different life. For a moment while dreaming, it felt completely real. But then you woke up, and almost instantly, most of the details began to fade. Sometimes, after a few minutes, you can't even remember the dream at all. The paradox of the forgotten dream asks, if a dream disappears completely from your memory, did it really happen? At first it seems simple. Of course the dream happened. You experienced it while you were asleep. Even if you forget it later, you were still there in that moment. But here's the strange part. If you can't recall anything about it, then from your perspective, it's as if the dream never existed at all. It leaves behind no memory, no record, no trace. Does something that vanishes so completely still count as part of your life? Now, let's extend this question beyond dreams and apply it to your waking life. Imagine you live through many experiences, happy days, sad days, quiet days, and then, over time, you forget them. You may no longer remember your first laugh as a baby, the exact feeling of holding a loved one's hand years ago, or even small but meaningful moments in childhood. If you can no longer recall them, do those moments still matter? Were they real in the same way as moments you still carry in memory? This paradox becomes even deeper when we think about the end of life. If consciousness truly ends at death, then everything you have ever experienced may vanish, just like a forgotten dream. your joys, your struggles, your achievements. If there is no one left to remember them, do they lose their meaning? Or does their value exist in the fact that they were once lived, even if they fade away afterward? Different philosophies have tried to answer this. In Buddhism, impermanence is seen as natural and not something to fear. Life is compared to things like cherry blossoms, which are beautiful precisely because they are brief. Their value doesn't depend on lasting forever, but on being appreciated while they exist. From this point of view, both dreams and life matter not because they are permanent, but because they are experienced. There is also another way to look at it. Even when you forget a dream, it may still leave subtle effects. Maybe it shapes your mood when you wake up, influences your thoughts during the day, or stirs emotions that you can't quite explain. In the same way, forgotten moments in your life may still leave imprints on who you are, even if you can't consciously remember them. A forgotten smile, a word of encouragement, or a fleeting kindness might ripple outward in ways you don't fully realize. So, did the forgotten dream exist? One answer is yes, because it was real in the moment, even if you don't remember it now. Another answer is no, because from your perspective, what cannot be remembered may as well have never happened. The paradox doesn't have a final solution, but it forces us to reflect on what makes experiences meaningful. Is it their permanence, or simply the fact that we lived them? Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Life, like dreams, is fragile and fleeting. But that doesn't make it meaningless. The paradox of the forgotten dream reminds us to value the present moment, to live fully while experiences are happening, because they may fade later. What matters most may not be how long they last in memory, but how deeply they are lived when they occur. Buridan's ass paradox. Buridan's ass paradox is a simple story, but it reveals something very deep about decision-making and human behavior. Imagine a donkey standing between two identical piles of hay. Both piles are the same size, the same distance away, and equally appealing. The donkey is hungry and wants to eat, but since both options are perfectly equal, it cannot find a reason to choose one over the other. Because it cannot decide, it stands frozen in place. Time passes, and in the end, the donkey starves to death, even though food was right in front of it. At first this sounds like a silly tale, but the meaning behind it is serious. The paradox shows the danger of indecision. If two options seem exactly the same, the donkey cannot logically decide between them. In real life, people often experience the same thing. You may face two job offers that both look equally good, two cities to live in that both have advantages, or two choices in daily life that both seem fine. The harder you try to decide which is better, the more stuck you may become. Just like the donkey, you can freeze while life keeps moving. The lesson of the story is that not making a choice can sometimes be worse than making the wrong choice. For the donkey, choosing either pile would have kept it alive. But because it waited for the perfect choice, it made no choice at all, and that became the worst outcome. For people, hesitation often means lost opportunities. Life does not wait for us to decide. If we hold back too long, the options may disappear, or the moment may pass. Psychologists explain that people get stuck because of fear. One fear is the fear of regret. If you choose one path, you might always wonder whether the other would have been better. Another fear is the desire for perfection. We often want the best option, not just a good one, and when we cannot find proof of which option is so best, we hesitate. But in reality, most decisions do not have a clear best choice, and waiting endlessly only leads to frustration. Some philosophers suggest that when two options are equal, it is actually safe to choose either one. If the donkey had simply picked a pile at random, it would have lived. In human terms, this means that when both paths look equally good, either path can lead to growth and experience. The act of choosing itself is what matters. Some even suggest flipping a coin in such situations. It might feel silly, but if both options are good, then letting chance break the tie can free you from paralysis. The deeper message of Buridan's ass paradox is that action is usually better than inaction. Life is full of uncertainty, and we rarely get perfect clarity. The danger of waiting too long for certainty is that we may lose the chance to act at all. The donkey starved not because food was missing, but because it never chose. In the same way, many of us miss opportunities not because choices were bad, but because we failed to act. This paradox teaches that sometimes we must accept uncertainty and move forward anyway. Choosing does not guarantee a perfect outcome, but it guarantees movement, progress, and the possibility of new opportunities. In contrast, refusing to choose leaves us stuck in the same place, slowly running out of time. Buridan's donkey reminds us that even when options look equal, any step forward is better than standing still. The Sorites Paradox, the Paradox of the Heap. The Sorites Paradox, also called the Paradox of the Heap, begins with something that seems simple. Imagine you have a heap of sand sitting in front of you. It is clearly a heap. Now take away 1 grain of sand. It is still a heap. Take away another grain, and another, and nothing seems to change. But if you continue this process, eventually you are left with only 1 grain of sand. At that point, it no longer feels right to call it a heap. The puzzle is this: at what exact moment did the heap stop being a heap? Was it when you removed the last grain, or the 100th grain, or some other number? No matter where you try to draw the line, it feels arbitrary, and that is where the paradox lies. This problem is not limited to sand. It applies to many everyday concepts. Think about baldness. If a person loses 1 hair, they are not bald. If they lose a few more, they are still not bald. But at some point, they are. So when does the change actually happen? The same problem exists with words like tall, rich, or even old. How many inches make someone tall? How much money makes someone rich? How many years make someone old? The paradox shows that vague concepts do not have sharp boundaries, yet we use them all the time as if they do. When we apply the Sorites paradox to human identity, it becomes even more interesting. Over time, you slowly change. You lose old habits, pick up new ones, and shift in personality in ways that are hard to notice day by day. If you look at yourself compared to who you were 10 years ago, the difference may feel large. But when, exactly, did you become a different version of yourself? There is no single moment that marks the change. Just as a heap disappears grain by grain, identity shifts piece by piece, in ways that are almost invisible as they happen. Some philosophers argue that the paradox proves that language is fuzzy and that we should not expect precise answers for every concept. Life is full of gradual changes, and trying to force exact cutoffs often creates artificial or meaningless rules. Others try to fix the problem by setting clear definitions, like saying a heap must be at least a certain number of grains, but this solution feels unsatisfying because it does not match how people actually use words in everyday life. The Sorites paradox teaches us something important about change and perception. We like to believe that big shifts happen suddenly, but in reality, most changes are slow and incremental. A heap disappears 1 grain at a time. A person changes 1 small decision, 1 new habit, 1 forgotten memory at a time. You rarely notice the transformation until you step back and realize how much has already shifted. The lesson of the paradox is not to find the exact point where things change, because that point may not exist. Instead, it reminds us to accept the gray areas of life. Not everything can be reduced to clear lines and simple labels. Words like heap, tall, bald, or even self are tools we use to describe the world, but they are not perfect. Life is full of gradual transitions, and the Sorites paradox shows us that embracing that uncertainty may be the most honest way to understand reality. The Paradox of Theseus identity. Imagine a perfect copy of you is created, not just in appearance but in every detail. This clone has the same body, the same scars, the same voice, and even the same memories. It remembers your childhood, your favorite food, your first heartbreak, and the way you laugh. From its perspective, it truly believes it is you. But if you're standing here and the clone is standing there, which one of you is the real you? This is the paradox of Theseus's identity, a twist on the Ship of Theseus. Instead of replacing parts of a ship, we imagine replacing or duplicating parts of a person. If someone can build a second version of you that matches you in every possible way, is that second version really you, or is it just a copy? The problem becomes even harder when you realize that, physically, your body is always changing anyway. The cells you had as a child are no longer here. Your body constantly replaces itself, and yet you still believe you are the same person. If you can remain you despite constant change, then why would a perfect clone not also count as you? Some might argue that identity is about continuity. You are the same person because your life flows like a single story. You have lived through your past, your experiences, your choices, and those shape who you are now. A clone, even if it has all your memories, has not actually lived your life. It has just been given the end result. By that logic, the clone cannot truly be you, because it lacks the real continuity of your journey. But others see identity as something more flexible. If the clone feels your emotions, remembers your life, and acts like you, then from a practical perspective, it is you. To everyone around you, there would be no difference. Even you yourself might not be able to tell if you were the original or the copy. This raises the unsettling idea that identity may no be fixed at all, but something that can be shared, duplicated, or divided. The paradox becomes even more troubling if you imagine the clone taking over your life. Suppose it goes to your job, spends time with your friends, and lives in your home. People would treat it as you, and the clone itself would believe it is you. Meanwhile, you are still here, living your own version of the story. Over time, your experiences would start to differ. Two versions of you would exist, slowly becoming less alike. So which one is really you, or are both equally you in different ways? This thought experiment forces us to confront how fragile the idea of individuality can be. We like to think of ourselves as unique and unrepeatable. But if everything that makes us who we are, our body, our mind, and our memories, can be perfectly copied, then what exactly makes us original? Is there some deeper essence that cannot be duplicated? Or are we only stories held together by memory and experience? The paradox of Theseus' identity has no easy answer, but it reveals something important. Identity is not simple. It is not just about physical matter or about memories. It may be a mixture of continuity, perception, and the way others see us. Whether or not a clone would be you, the paradox reminds us that the question of who we really are is far more complicated than it seems. The paradox of time and now. Close your eyes for a moment and try to focus only on the present. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, but this exact instant. The sound around you, the rhythm of your breath, the simple fact that you exist here and now. It feels like the present is all you truly have. But the more you try to hold on to it, the more it slips away. Every second you notice is already gone, replaced by another. This is the paradox of time and now, and it raises a difficult question. Does the present moment really exist, or is it only an illusion created by your mind? The past no longer exists. You cannot reach back and touch it, no matter how vivid your memories feel. The future does not exist yet either. It is unknown and uncertain, shaped only by possibilities. The only thing we believe we have is the present, the now. But if you try to measure or capture it, the present seems to shrink into nothing. If the present is just the dividing line between past and future, then it must be infinitely small, so small that it is almost meaningless. If that is true, then what does it mean to live in the present? Philosophers and scientists have struggled with this question for centuries. Some describe time as a river, always flowing forward. In that view, the present is simply a point on the river's surface, constantly moving, never fixed. But others argue that the past, present, and future all exist together in what is called the block universe theory. In this picture, time does not flow at all. Instead, every moment exists at once, and what you call the present is simply the part your consciousness is currently experiencing. If that is the case, then the present is not special. It is just where your mind happens to be in the timeline. The paradox becomes even more confusing when we think about how the brain works. Your senses do not give you reality instantly. When light tease your eyes or sound waves reach your ears, it takes time, tiny fractions of a second for your brain to process that information. This means you are always living a little behind the real present. What you think of as now is already the past by the time you experience it. The true present, if it exists at all, may be something you can never directly touch. Despite this, our lives are completely shaped by how we treat the present. We worry about the future, we dwell on the past, but everything we do happens in the now. Even when you think about the past or plan for tomorrow, those thoughts are happening in this moment. So if the present is an illusion, it is still the only illusion you can ever live in. That makes it both everything and nothing at the same time. In daily life, this paradox has a powerful effect. Many people struggle to live in the moment because they are caught in memories of what has already happened or fears of what might come next. Yet focusing too much on now can also feel impossible, because as soon as you notice it, it changes. This constant shifting can feel unsettling, as if life is always slipping away faster than you can hold it. Some traditions, like Buddhism and mindfulness practices, suggest that the way to approach this paradox is not to solve it, but to embrace it. The present is fleeting, yes, but that is what makes it precious. You cannot capture it, but you can experience it. Each breath, each step, each small moment of awareness is real, even if it vanishes as soon as it arrives. Instead of clinging to the present or worrying about its meaning, these teachings encourage people to simply live it. The paradox of time and now shows us that existence itself is both fragile and mysterious. Time feels solid in daily life. We wake, we work, we age, but under close examination, it dissolves into something uncertain. The present seems to be the only thing we have, and yet it may not even exist in the way we imagine. Perhaps the lesson is that life is not about holding on to time, but about moving with it. The present is not something to keep, but something to experience as it flows by. In the end, the paradox does not need a final answer. Maybe the present is real, maybe it is an illusion, or maybe it is something beyond our understanding. But what matters is that every moment you live is filled with the chance to feel, to act, and to be. Whether or not the present exists in some deep philosophical sense, it is still the space where your life unfolds. The paradox invites you to let go of the need for certainty and instead live fully, moment by moment, in the mystery of now. The paradox of free will versus determinism. Every day you make choices. You decide what to eat, where to go, who to talk to, and how to live your life. It feels natural to believe that these choices are your own, guided by free will. But the paradox of free will versus determinism challenges this belief. It asks, are you really free to choose, or are your decisions already determined by causes outside your control? Determinism is the idea that everything in the universe happens for a reason, caused by something that came before. A seed grows into a tree because of soil, water, and sunlight. A river flows because of gravity. Your thoughts and actions, according to determinism, are also the result of prior causes. Your genetics, your upbringing, your environment, and even the chemical activity in your brain. If that is true, then when you make a decision, you are not truly free. You are simply following the chain of events that led to that moment, like a domino falling after the one before it. But if everything is determined, then free will seems like an illusion. You feel like you are choosing, but in reality you're only experiencing the outcome of conditions that were set long before you were born. This leads to troubling questions. If your actions are determined, are you responsible for them? If someone commits a crime because of their background, brain chemistry, or environment, can they truly be blamed? And if everything is fixed, what is the point of effort, struggle, or even hope? On the other hand, if free will exists, it raises its own problems. If your choices are not determined by causes, then where do they come from? If an action is completely free and disconnected from any cause, it begins to look random, like a coin flip. But randomness is not the same as freedom. Real freedom would mean you are the true origin of your choices, but it is hard to explain how that is possible in a universe of cause and effect. Philosophers have responded to this paradox in different ways. Some believe determinism is true and free will does not exist. According to this view, your sense of freedom is just a feeling, not a fact. Others believe in what is called compatibilism. This is the idea that free will and determinism can work together. Even if your choices are influenced by causes, you are still free as long as you act according to your desires and values, instead of being forced by something external. In other words, freedom does not mean being free from all causes. It means being free from coercion. The paradox matters because it touches the core of human life. If we are free, then we are responsible for what we do. If we are determined, then responsibility might be an illusion, and morality becomes harder to justify. Laws, rewards, and punishments would lose their meaning if no one could have acted differently. But perhaps responsibility still makes sense if it helps shape future actions, even in a determined system. Punishing someone might not make sense in terms of blame, but it could still make sense as a way to influence behavior. In daily life, the paradox shows up in subtle ways. When you regret a decision, you feel like you could have chosen differently. But if determinism is true, there was no other option. You were always going to choose the way you did. Yet this does not stop you from feeling regret or pride. The human mind is built to experience life as if choices are open, even if they are not. The paradox of free will versus determinism may never be solved completely. It may be that both ideas contain some truth. Perhaps the universe is shaped by causes, but within those causes, we still carve out space for choice and meaning. Or perhaps free will is an illusion, but one we must live with, because it gives life purpose. What the paradox teaches most of all is humility. Whether or not you are truly free, you still live as though your decisions matter. And maybe that is the point. Even if the universe is determined, your experience of choosing shapes the story of your life. The paradox does not destroy freedom. It reminds us how mysterious and precious it feels. Zeno's paradox of motion. More than 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Zeno created a set of puzzles to challenge how people think about motion and change. One of the most famous is the paradox of motion, sometimes called the dichotomy paradox. Imagine you are trying to walk across a room. To get to the other side, you must first reach the halfway point. Before you reach the halfway point, you must reach a quarter of the way. Before that, you must reach an eighth, and before that, a 16th. Each step requires reaching a smaller and smaller distance first. In theory, this sequence continues forever, with no final step to complete. If there are infinitely many points you must cross, how can you ever reach the other side of the room? The paradox does not stop there. Zeno also described the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine the great runner Achilles racing a slow-moving tortoise. To make the race fair, the tortoise is given a small head start. Achilles begins to run, but before he can catch the tortoise, he must first reach the spot where the tortoise started. By then, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead. Achilles runs to that new spot, but the tortoise has again moved forward, even if only by a small distance. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has already gone slightly farther. According to the paradox, Achilles will never actually catch up, even though he is much faster. At first, these puzzles sound absurd, Of course you can walk across a room. Of course a fast runner can catch a slow tortoise. We see it happen every day. But Zeno's paradoxes show that when you break motion into infinite steps, logic begins to collapse. How can you cross an infinite number of points in a finite amount of time? If space and time can be divided endlessly, motion itself seems impossible. The paradox fascinated philosophers and mathematicians for centuries. Some argued that motion must be an illusion. The ancient philosopher Parmenides, Zeno's teacher, believed that change and movement were tricks of the senses, and Zeno's paradoxes were meant to defend that view. If motion leads to contradiction, then perhaps reality is still and unchanging, and only our perception makes it seem otherwise. Later, mathematics tried to solve the problem through the concept of infinity. The idea of infinite series shows that even though there are infinitely many steps to cross the room, the total distance and time can still add up to a finite number. For example, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 continues forever, but the total sum approaches 1. This means that even an infinite number of smaller and smaller steps can still equal a finite distance, allowing motion to be possible after all. In this way, calculus, invented thousands of years later, gave a formal answer to Zeno's puzzles. But even with mathematics, the paradox continues to raise questions. If the world can be divided into infinite parts, does that mean space and time are continuous, with no smallest unit? Or is reality actually made up of tiny, indivisible chunks, like the pixels on a screen, that prevent infinite division? If the universe is continuous, then Zeno's paradoxes still show how strange infinity really is. If it is not, then there must be a smallest step of distance or time, which challenges how we usually imagine reality. On a personal level, Zeno's paradox of motion also has a symbolic meaning. Sometimes in life, reaching a goal can feel impossible because there are so many small steps along the way. Each time you get closer, there is still more distance to cover. The paradox reminds us that progress often feels endless, but just like walking across a room, persistence leads to completion. The infinite steps may seem overwhelming in theory, but in practice, motion continues and goals are reached. Zeno's paradox does not stop you from walking or running, but it forces you to think about what motion, time, and space really are. It shows how something as ordinary as moving from one place to another hides deep mysteries about infinity and reality. Even if mathematics offers solutions, the paradox still sparks wonder. It reminds us that the simplest things in life, walking, running, moving, can lead to questions without easy answers. Perhaps that is why Zeno's ideas have lasted for so long. They show that even in ordinary experience, the universe is far more mysterious than it first appears. The Omnipotence Paradox. The Omnipotence Paradox is one of the most famous puzzles in philosophy and religion because it challenges the very idea of unlimited power. The word omnipotence means having complete and absolute power, with no limits at all. Philosophers often use a simple but tricky question to test this idea. If a being is truly all-powerful, can it create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? If it cannot create such a stone, then its power has limits. But if it can create the stone and then it cannot lift it, its power is also limited. Either way, the idea of unlimited power seems to defeat itself. At first, this puzzle sounds like just a clever word trick, but it raises deep questions. If absolute power leads to contradictions, does true omnipotence exist at all? Can the very idea of having no limits even make sense? Some argue that omnipotence must mean being able to do absolutely anything, including the impossible. Others argue that true power cannot include contradictions, because contradictions are not things that can exist. For example, asking an all-powerful being to create a square circle is meaningless, because a square circle is not possible in the first place. This paradox is especially important in the context of religion. Many traditions describe God as all-powerful, and the paradox forces believers and philosophers to define what that means. If God is omnipotent, does that mean he can break the rules of logic itself? Or is his power only within the limits of what is logically possible? Some thinkers say that God's power is so complete that it does not need to be measured by impossible tasks. Others say that if God cannot do the impossible, then his power is not truly unlimited. The paradox does not provide easy answers, it only deepens the mystery of divine power. Beyond religion, the paradox also teaches us something about human ideas of power. People often imagine absolute freedom or unlimited control as desirable. But the paradox shows that power without limits may collapse into nonsense. Power, to make sense, might require some boundaries. In real life, even the strongest leaders, nations or individuals cannot have absolute control. There are always limits, of nature, of logic, or of circumstance. In fact, it may be those very limits that make power meaningful. The paradox can also be understood symbolically. The unliftable stone can represent the challenges in life that no amount of strength or control can overcome. No matter how powerful someone is, there are always forces beyond them. Time, death, uncertainty, or the unknown. The Omnipotence Paradox is a reminder that there will always be questions or tasks that defy even the greatest ability. In this way, it humbles the human desire to control everything and reminds us that some mysteries may never be solved. Some philosophers try to solve the paradox by redefining omnipotence. They say it should not mean the ability to do the logically impossible, but the ability to do everything that is possible. For example, an all-powerful being could create mountains, galaxies, or anything within reality, but not contradictions like a stone too heavy for itself to lift. This definition avoids the trap of the paradox, but also admits that power is not truly without limits. It is bound by logic. Others embrace the paradox itself, saying it shows that human logic is too limited to understand true power. If something like God exists, his nature may be beyond what our minds can describe. The omnipotence paradox continues to spark debate because it touches on both logic and faith, two of the deepest parts of human thought. It forces us to ask not only what power is, but also whether the concept of absolute power even makes sense. And perhaps its greatest lesson is that ultimate power is not about breaking logic, but about shaping meaning within it. Whether or not the paradox can be solved, it remains a powerful reminder of the limits of human understanding and the mysteries that lie beyond. The paradox of the infinite library. Imagine stepping into a library so large that it contains every possible book that could ever exist. This library does not just hold the books we know, the novels, the history texts, the poetry, and the science manuals, but every possible combination of words, letters, and symbols arranged into every possible sequence. Inside this library, there would be books that describe the entire history of the universe with complete accuracy, alongside books filled with nothing but random nonsense. There would be a book that tells the true story of your life in perfect detail, and another that tells the same story, but with one detail changed. There would be endless books predicting the future, some correct, most incorrect, and many repeating endlessly with slight variations. This thought experiment, sometimes called the Library of Babel, creates the paradox of the infinite library. At first, such a library sounds like a paradise. With infinite knowledge, all answers must exist somewhere inside it. But quickly the problem becomes clear. If every possible book exists, then the truth is drowned in an infinite sea of falsehoods. To find one true book, you must sort through infinite nonsense. In practice, it would be impossible to know which book to trust. The paradox is that in a library of infinite knowledge, knowledge becomes unreachable. Infinite information turns into the same as having no information at all. This puzzle is not only about imaginary libraries, it reflects real struggles with knowledge and meaning in our lives today. The internet, for example, sometimes feels like a miniature version of the infinite library. For almost any question, countless answers can be found, some true, some false, some misleading, and some just noise. The challenge is not that information is missing, but that it is overwhelming. Too much information can be just as paralyzing as too little, and the paradox reminds us that more is not always better. The infinite library also forces us to think about meaning. If every possible book exists, then every story is written somewhere. But if all possible stories are already contained within the library, does that make your personal story less unique? Somewhere, there would be an exact copy of your life, and also endless versions where one detail is different, where you wore a different shirt yesterday, or where you made a different choice years ago. In an infinite library, your uniqueness may seem lost among countless variations of you, but at the same time, the version you are living right now may be the only one that truly matters, because it is the one you actually experience. Philosophers also use this paradox to talk about the nature of infinity. Infinity is not just a very large number, it is something fundamentally different. When you deal with infinity, normal rules of counting and comparing break down. In an infinite set, there can be just as many meaningless books as meaningful ones, and both are infinite. This strange balance creates the paradox. The more complete the library becomes, the harder it is to find meaning inside it. There is also a symbolic way to understand the paradox. The infinite library can represent the human mind or the universe itself. Within you are endless possibilities of thought, imagination, and interpretation. Within the universe are endless potential futures and realities. But the challenge is always the same. How do you find meaning within the infinite? The paradox suggests that meaning cannot come from sheer abundance, but from selection, focus, and interpretation. A single book chosen and understood may matter more than infinite unread books. A single moment lived fully may mean more than endless possibilities left unexplored. The paradox of the infinite library teaches us that infinity, while fascinating, can also be overwhelming. More knowledge does not always mean more wisdom, and more possibilities do not always lead to more meaning. To live within an infinite sea of choices, whether in books, information, or life paths, requires learning how to choose, how to focus, and how to create value within the overwhelming abundance. In a way, the paradox reflects our modern struggle. Surrounded by endless data, we still search for truth, clarity, and meaning in a world that often feels infinite. The paradox of the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is one of the most famous paradoxes in game theory and philosophy, because it shows how rational decisions made by individuals can lead to irrational outcomes for everyone involved. The story begins with two criminals who have been caught and placed in separate cells. The police do not have enough evidence to convict them of the major crime, so they offer each prisoner a deal. If one prisoner betrays the other by confessing while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free and the silent one receives a heavy sentence. If both remain silent, they each get a light sentence, but if both betray each other, they both receive a medium sentence. Each prisoner must decide what to do without knowing what the other will choose. On the surface, the logical choice for each prisoner seems to be betrayal. If you are one of the prisoners, you reason that if the other stays silent, you can go free by confessing. If the other betrays you, you avoid the worst punishment by betraying as well. Betrayal seems safer in both cases. But here lies the paradox. If both prisoners follow this logic, they both end up betraying and receiving a worse outcome than if they had simply trusted each other and stayed silent. The result is that rational thinking at the individual level leads to a worse outcome at the group level. This paradox is not just about prisoners, it is about life itself. It represents countless situations in human society where cooperation would bring the best outcome, but fear, mistrust, or self-interest lead people to act against one another. Think about two countries building weapons. If both agree to disarm, they would be safer and save resources. But each fears that if it disarms while the other does not, it will be vulnerable. So both keep arming, creating tension and danger. Or consider businesses competing in a market. If they cooperate in fair ways, they can both succeed, but greed often pushes them into destructive competition. The prisoner's dilemma shows the fragile nature of trust. Cooperation requires faith that the other side will also cooperate. But without that faith, rational individuals often make choices that harm them in the long run. The paradox reveals that trust, honesty, and cooperation are not just moral values, but practical strategies for survival. Yet building trust is difficult, because betrayal always seems tempting when short-term gain is at stake. Philosophers and scientists have studied this paradox deeply. In repeated versions of the game, where prisoners face the dilemma many times, cooperation often becomes more stable. If you know you will see the other person again, you are more likely to cooperate, because betrayal today will be punished tomorrow. In this way, relationships, reputation, and long-term interaction create a system where cooperation can survive. This reflects real life, where trust is built not in one moment, but through repeated actions over time. The paradox also forces us to think about freedom and control. In theory, each prisoner is free to choose, but in practice, each is trapped by logic and fear. This mirrors many real-world systems where individuals are technically free, but bound by circumstances that push them towards certain choices. It raises the question of whether rationality always leads to the best outcome, or whether true wisdom sometimes requires stepping beyond cold logic and taking a risk on trust. On a personal level, the prisoner's dilemma plays out in everyday life. In friendships, relationships, and communities, trust and betrayal are constant choices. If two friends keep secrets for each other, their bond grows. But if one betrays, both suffer. If both betray, the friendship collapses. The paradox shows why loyalty and cooperation matter so deeply in human connections. Without them, fear and self-interest can destroy relationships that could have been strong. The lesson of the prisoner's dilemma is that cooperation, though risky, often leads to the best outcomes. Betrayal may seem safe in the moment, but it creates cycles of mistrust and harm. True progress requires courage, the courage to trust when fear tempts you to betray. The paradox remains unsolved because there will always be risk in choosing trust, but perhaps that risk is what makes cooperation meaningful. In a world full of dilemmas, the choice to cooperate is not just a strategy, but a statement of hope. The Paradox of the Silent Scream. The Paradox of the Silent Scream is one of those puzzles that is less about mathematics or logic and more about human experience and emotion. Imagine someone screaming with all their strength, but no sound comes out. Their mouth is open, their body shakes, their face is full of pain or fear, yet nothing can be heard. The scream exists, but at the same time, it does not. It is both present and absent. This image captures a strange and haunting paradox. How can something so powerful, so full of energy, exist in complete silence? At its heart, the paradox touches on the limits of expression. A scream is usually the most extreme form of human sound. It is raw, uncontrollable, and impossible to ignore. It carries with it fear, anger, pain, or desperation. But when the scream is silent, its purpose is defeated. A silent scream cannot call for help. It cannot warn others. It cannot communicate what the person is going through. It becomes both the strongest form of expression and the weakest one at the same time. That contradiction makes the silent scream so unsettling. Many people connect this paradox to dreams or nightmares. In a dream, you may find yourself in danger and try to cry out, but no sound comes. You feel the panic. You try to force the scream, but it is trapped inside you. The silent scream becomes a symbol of helplessness, the feeling of being overwhelmed by something you cannot control, yet being unable to make yourself heard. It reflects a deep human fear, the fear of being trapped inside your own experience without the ability to share it. But the paradox does not stop at dreams. In waking life, the silent scream also represents those moments when words fail. Think of times when you felt emotions too large to explain, grief so heavy that no sentence could capture it, anger so consuming that speech broke down, or joy so overwhelming that it left you speechless. The silent scream symbolizes the human struggle to express the inexpressible. It is both the most intense form of expression and the proof that some experiences are beyond language. There is also a social and moral layer to the paradox. The silent scream can stand for people who are suffering but ignored. Their pain is real, but the world does not hear it. Think of individuals who endure injustice, oppression, or isolation. Their scream may be silent, not because they do not try to speak, but because no one listens. In this sense, the paradox becomes a powerful metaphor for unheard voices, hidden suffering, and the human need for recognition. A scream that makes no sound is still a scream, but it challenges us to ask, if pain cannot be heard, does it still matter? The paradox reminds us that the answer is yes. It matters deeply, but the silence makes it even more tragic. Philosophers and artists often use this paradox to explore the limits of communication. Art, poetry, music, and storytelling are all attempts to give voice to the silent scream. They are ways of turning inner feelings into something that can be shared. Yet even art has its limits, and often the most powerful works are those that point directly to the impossibility of fully expressing what it feels like to be human. The silent scream becomes a reminder that there are always parts of experience that cannot be fully captured, no matter how hard we try. On a psychological level, the silent scream can also represent repression. Sometimes people hold back their true feelings out of fear, guilt, or shame. The scream is there inside them, but they do not let it out. They appear calm or silent on the outside while carrying storms within. This inner silence can be more painful than the scream itself, because it isolates the person from others. The paradox lies in the fact that silence is both protection and prison. It hides the truth, but it also deepens the loneliness. The paradox of the silent scream reminds us of both the power and the limits of expression. It shows us that some things can be felt, but never fully spoken, heard, or shared. It also teaches us the importance of listening, not only to words, but to what lies beyond them, the quiet signals of pain, joy, or fear that others may struggle to voice. The silent scream exists in the space between sound and silence, between expression and inexpressibility, between isolation and the desire to be known. In the end, the paradox does not give us a solution. It simply reflects a truth of human existence, that some experiences are too vast for words, too heavy for sound, and too deep for anyone else to fully hear. But perhaps that is what makes them real. The silent scream may not be heard, but it is still felt, and in that feeling lies its strange and haunting power. The paradox of perception. The paradox of perception begins with a simple question. Can we ever truly know the world as it really is, or do we only know the version of it that our senses create for us? Every moment of your life, your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin collect information, and your brain turns it into an experience of reality. But this raises a problem. What you call reality may not be the world itself, but only a construction made by your mind. You never see the world directly. You only see light waves hitting your eyes, sound waves striking your ears, and signals traveling through your nervous system. Your experience of reality is always filtered, translated, and interpreted. So the paradox is this. If perception is our only way of knowing reality, and perception itself is unreliable, then how can we ever be sure what is real? Consider something as basic as color. When you look at a red apple, you are sure it is red, but the apple does not actually contain redness. Instead, its surface reflects light at a certain wavelength, and your brain interprets that wavelength as the color red. A different creature with different eyes might see that same apple in a completely different color. In fact, many animals see parts of the light spectrum that humans cannot see at all, like ultraviolet. So the apple's redness feels real to you, but it is not an objective property of the apple. It is a creation of your perception. This shows how what feels obvious and undeniable may actually be relative to the way your senses are built. The paradox deepens when you consider illusions. Optical illusions can make straight lines appear bent, still images appear to move, or two different colors appear the same. Your brain fills in gaps, creates patterns, and sometimes sees things that are not there. If your perception can be fooled so easily in small cases, how can you be sure it is not fooling you all the time? What you call reality may be just a useful version of the world that your brain creates, not reality itself. Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, argued that there is a difference between the world as it is, the thing in itself, and the world as we perceive it. According to him, we can never directly know the true world. We only know the world as it appears to us through our senses and mental categories. Others go even further, suggesting that reality may be entirely unknowable, and that what we call truth is nothing more than a shared illusion that allows us to survive. On the other hand, perception is the only tool we have. Even if it is not perfect, it is how we live, how we communicate, and how we build knowledge. Science itself depends on perception, even though it tries to refine it with instruments, experiments, and logic. A telescope or microscope is just an extension of the eye, designed to help us see more clearly. But it still delivers information through the same sensory channels. So we are trapped. Perception may be unreliable, but it is all we have, and without it, we would know nothing at all. The paradox of perception is not just a problem of philosophy. It is also deeply personal. Every individual perceives the world in slightly different ways. Two people can see the same event and interpret it differently. One person may hear a word as kind, another may hear it as insulting. Our personal histories, emotions, and expectations shape what we perceive. In this way, perception is not just about seeing the world, but about constructing it in our own minds. Reality itself becomes, at least in part, a subjective experience. In daily life, this paradox teaches both caution and humility. It reminds us not to assume that our perspective is the only truth. Others may see the same world differently, not because they are wrong, but because perception itself is not fixed. It also teaches us to question appearances. Just because something looks or feels a certain way does not mean it truly is that way. Behind every perception is a deeper mystery we cannot fully uncover. The paradox of perception does not mean we should give up on truth, but it shows us that truth is always filtered. Reality might exist beyond our senses, but we will always experience it through the limits of human perception. The paradox leaves us with a haunting question. Are we living in the world as it really is, or only in the version of it that our minds allow us to see? The answer may never be clear, but perhaps the value lies not in solving the paradox, but in remembering how fragile and uncertain our grip on reality really is. The Paradox of the Unreliable Narrator, Brain in a Vat. The paradox of the unreliable narrator, often imagined through the brain in a vat thought experiment, is one of the most unsettling paradoxes in philosophy because it questions whether we can ever truly trust our own reality. Picture this. Your brain has been removed from your body and placed in a special vat of nutrients that keeps it alive. Electrodes are attached to your brain, and a computer feeds it electrical signals that perfectly mimic the sensations of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. To you, life would feel exactly the same as it does now. You would still see the sky, hear voices, feel the wind, and taste food. You would never suspect that everything around you was nothing more than signals sent to your brain. The paradox is this. If all your experiences could be illusions created by an outside source, how can you ever know whether your world is real? This idea is not only a philosophical puzzle, but also a terrifying possibility. If your senses are your only connection to reality, and if those senses can be perfectly fooled, then everything you believe could be false. You might think you are walking down a street, talking to a friend, or remembering your past, but all of it could be fabricated by the computer controlling your brain. Even your thoughts and emotions might not be your own, but part of the illusion. The paradox forces you to ask, if you cannot step outside your experience to check it against reality, how do you know there is a reality at all? The brain in a vat scenario is a modern twist on an old question. Philosophers like Descartes asked similar things centuries ago. Descartes wondered if an evil demon might be deceiving him into believing in a false world. His solution was to doubt everything until he found something that could not be doubted, the fact that he was thinking. 4. On this he concluded, I think, therefore I am. But even this solution is not perfect, because while thinking may prove you exist in some form, it does not prove that the world around you exists. This paradox is often compared to the idea of the unreliable narrator in literature. In some stories, the person telling the story cannot be trusted. They might be lying, confused, or delusional. The brain in a vat suggests that your own senses may be the most unreliable narrator of all. They tell you a story about reality, but you cannot be sure whether that story is true. You may live your whole life trusting a narrator that deceives you completely. The problem grows even deeper when we consider technology. Movies like The Matrix popularize this idea by imagining humans trapped in a simulated world without realizing it. Today, with the rise of virtual reality and artificial intelligence, the line between simulation and reality feels thinner than ever. If computers can create convincing worlds now, what would stop them from creating a reality so perfect that no one could tell the difference? The paradox suggests that you may already be in such a reality and simply not know it. But the paradox is not only about fear, it also raises questions about meaning. If your reality is an illusion, does that make your life meaningless? Or is meaning something you create through experience, whether or not the experience is real? If you laugh, cry, love, and suffer, those feelings are real to you, even if the world causing them is not. The brain in a vat forces you to ask whether truth itself is necessary for meaning, or whether the experience of living is enough. Some philosophers try to answer the paradox by saying it does not matter whether we are in a vat or not. If we can never step outside our perception, then the only reality that matters is the one we experience. Others argue that we should not dismiss the question so quickly, because if reality can be faked, then the search for truth becomes even more important. But no matter which view you take, the paradox leaves behind it an unsettling uncertainty that cannot be erased. The paradox of the unreliable narrator, brain in a vat, reminds us that reality is not something we hold in our hands. It is something we trust with our minds. And trust, by its very nature, can be broken. Whether or not we are truly brains in vats, the paradox forces us to face the fragility of our beliefs. It shows us that the ground we stand on might not be as solid as it feels, and that certainty itself may be the greatest illusion of all. The paradox of the infinite monkey theorem. The infinite monkey theorem is one of the strangest and most thought-provoking paradoxes about chance, randomness, and infinity. Imagine placing a monkey in front of a typewriter. The monkey begins to press keys at random with no plan or knowledge of language. On its own, this seems meaningless, just random strings of letters, numbers, and symbols. But the theorem says that if the monkey had an infinite amount of time, eventually it would type every possible combination of words, sentences, and books. That means, in theory, the monkey would eventually write every novel ever written, and even those that have not been written yet. Somewhere in its infinite typing, it would produce the complete works of Shakespeare, perfectly spelled and punctuated, as well as every possible book that could ever exist. The paradox lies in the difference between possibility and practicality. Yes, the monkey could eventually type something meaningful, but the odds are so small that in any realistic amount of time, it would never happen. The chance of producing just a short sentence like, "I am here," through random keystrokes is astronomically low. The chance of producing an entire novel is so close to zero that it may as well be impossible within the lifetime of the universe. And yet, because infinity allows endless chances, the theorem insists it must eventually happen. Something that feels impossible becomes inevitable if you stretch time far enough. This thought experiment is not really about monkeys or typewriters. It is about understanding infinity and randomness. Infinity changes the rules of probability. In a finite world, some things are so unlikely that they will never occur. But in an infinite world, no matter how unlikely something is, given enough time it must occur. That is both fascinating and disturbing, because it suggests that in an infinite universe, every possible event, every possible story, every possible version of you exists somewhere. The paradox also shows the strange relationship between order and chaos. The monkey's typing is pure chaos, with no design or meaning, yet out of that chaos, order emerges. Meaningful works of art, literature, and history would appear purely by chance. This challenges our ideas about creativity and value. If a random process can produce Shakespeare's plays, does that make them less special? Or does their value come not from the words themselves, but from the intention, emotion, and understanding behind them? The paradox forces us to ask whether meaning lies in the product or in the process that creates it. In modern times, the infinite monkey theorem is sometimes compared to how computers and randomness work. For example, scientists use random algorithms to explore possibilities, and sometimes unexpected solutions appear. The paradox also reflects how evolution itself can be seen. Small random changes over long periods of time can produce complex life forms, just as random typing over infinite time can produce great works of literature. It shows how patterns and beauty can emerge from randomness, though only when given vast amounts of time and opportunity. On a personal level, the paradox connects to the way we live our lives. Often people look for meaning and order in the world, but much of life is shaped by chance, by where you were born, the people you meet, the opportunities you are given. The infinite monkey theorem reminds us that chance, no matter how chaotic it seems, can produce meaningful outcomes. Even in randomness, there is always the possibility of something extraordinary happening. At the same time, the paradox is a warning about how overwhelming infinity really is. If everything is possible, then meaning can easily get lost in the endless noise. Just as the infinite library drowns truth in endless falsehoods, the infinite monkey drowns creativity in endless nonsense. Out of infinite pages, only a tiny fraction would make sense, and finding them would be nearly impossible. This highlights the importance of focus, structure, and intention in human life. Unlike the monkey, we do not rely on pure chance. We create meaning through choice, purpose, and will. The infinite monkey theorem leaves us with both wonder and unease. It shows that infinity makes the impossible inevitable, that chaos can give birth to order, and that randomness itself contains endless potential. But it also reminds us that meaning does not come automatically from possibility. It must be found, chosen, or created by us. In the end, the monkey's endless typing is a mirror of the universe itself, infinite, chaotic, and full of every possibility, waiting for us to decide which ones matter. The Paradox of the Arrow, Zeno's Paradox. The Paradox of the Arrow is another of Zeno's puzzles that challenges the very idea of motion. Imagine an arrow flying through the air toward its target. At any single instant of time, the arrow is not moving. It simply occupies a space equal to its own length. If you freeze time in one moment, the arrow is at rest. Now imagine all of time as a series of such instants, like frames in a movie. At each frame, the arrow is motionless. If time is made up of nothing but these frozen moments, and the arrow is at rest in every one of them, then how can motion ever exist? At first, this seems ridiculous. You can throw an arrow, and it will clearly move across space until it hits its target. But Zeno's paradox forces us to think more deeply about what motion really is. If motion is just a collection of motionless instants, then where does the motion come from? If time is made of indivisible slices, each slice showing no change, then motion appears to be an illusion created by stringing those slices together. The paradox becomes easier to imagine if you think of a film reel or a digital video. A movie is made of still frames shown one after another. Each frame by itself shows no motion. The illusion of movement comes from the rapid sequence of images. Zeno's paradox suggests that reality itself may be like this, a collection of still moments that somehow create the appearance of continuous motion. But if that is true, then motion is not real. It is just a trick of perception. This paradox touches on some of the deepest questions in physics and philosophy. Is time continuous, flowing smoothly like a river? Or is it made of discrete units, like individual frames of a movie? If time is continuous, then Zeno's paradox forces us to confront the strange nature of infinity, an infinite number of instants within any stretch of time. If time is discrete, then motion must jump from one frame to the next, raising questions about how smooth motion can exist at all. Modern physics has tried to tackle these questions. Calculus, developed thousands of years after Zeno, provides a way to describe motion as the limit of infinitely small changes over time. It allows us to define velocity and acceleration, even though, at any instant, the arrow seems motionless. In this way, mathematics offers a resolution. But deeper problems remain. In quantum mechanics, for example, particles sometimes behave in ways that suggest reality may not be continuous. At the smallest scales, motion is uncertain, blurred, and strange, which means Zeno's paradox is not just a clever puzzle, but a reflection of real mysteries about time and space. On a symbolic level, the paradox of the arrow reminds us that life itself can feel frozen in moments. Sometimes in the middle of change, it feels like nothing is happening. But when you step back and look at the flow of time, you see the movement. Each moment by itself seems static, but together they create the story of your life. Just like the arrow, we are always moving, even when we feel still. The paradox of the arrow forces us to recognize that motion is not as simple as it seems. What looks obvious in daily life, an arrow flying, a person walking, a planet orbiting, hides deep mysteries about time, space, and perception. It challenges us to think beyond appearances and to question whether reality itself is continuous or made up of countless frozen instants. In either case, the arrow still reaches its target, but Zeno's puzzle ensures we never take motion for granted again. The paradox of death's meaning. The paradox of death's meaning is one of the deepest puzzles that human beings have struggled with for thousands of years. On the one hand, death feels like the most important event in life. It is the final moment, the end of everything we know. On the other hand, when death arrives, it is no longer experienced by the person who dies. In that sense, death may be nothing at all, because the person who could experience it is gone. The paradox is simple yet haunting. Death seems to be both the most meaningful and the most meaningless event in human existence. When we are alive, we cannot fully grasp what death is, because we have never experienced it. We can imagine it, fear it, and wonder about it. But we cannot step outside of life to see it directly. When death actually comes, we are no longer here to think or feel anything about it. As the ancient philosopher Epicurus said, death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist. But if death is nothing, why does it cast such a powerful shadow over life? Why does the thought of it shape so much of what we do, from building families and pursuing dreams, to creating religions and seeking immortality through art or memory? One way to see the paradox is to recognize that death gives life its urgency and meaning. If we lived forever, there would be no reason to hurry, no reason to value time, and no reason to choose. Every opportunity would still be available later. But because we know life is finite, our choices become precious. Every day carries weight because we know there are only so many days left. In this sense, death is what makes life meaningful. The very thing that ends life also gives it value. Yet at the same time, death seems to erase meaning, because everything we build, our achievements, possessions, even our memories, eventually disappears when we are gone. Death both creates meaning and destroys it. The paradox grows more complex when we consider different perspectives. To the living, death is mysterious and terrifying because it represents the unknown. But to the dead, if non-existence truly is like nothingness, death cannot be terrifying at all. It would be like the state before you were born, an endless nothing that you never even noticed. If that is true, then death itself is not frightening, but the thought of it while alive is unbearable. The paradox is that we suffer from death only while we are alive to think about it, but never when it actually happens. Religions and philosophies have tried to solve this paradox in different ways. Some teach that death is not the end, but a passage into another form of existence, heaven, reincarnation, or a return to the divine. These beliefs suggest that death is not meaningless, because life continues in another form. Others take a more secular view, saying that death is the final end, but our meaning comes from the impact we leave behind, our actions, our creations, and the memories others hold of us. Yet even here the paradox remains, because over long enough time, even those legacies fade. Civilizations rise and fall, stars burn out, and the universe itself may end. What does meaning mean in the face of such vastness? On a personal level, the paradox of death's meaning shows up in the way people live their lives. Some deny death, avoiding the thought as much as possible. Others embrace it, using it as motivation to live more fully. Some despair, thinking life is pointless if death erases everything, while others find freedom in the idea that nothing ultimately matters, so we are free to create our own meaning. The paradox allows for both. Death can be a source of fear and despair, or a source of courage and inspiration. Philosophers often say that to think about death is to think about life itself. If death is nothing, then life is everything, and we must pour ourselves into it while we have the chance. If death is something more, then life may be a preparation for what comes after. Either way, death defines life, not by what it is, but by the way we respond to it. In the end, the paradox of death's meaning cannot be solved with certainty. We do not know whether death is an end, a continuation, or something beyond human understanding. But perhaps that is the point. Death is both the ultimate nothing and the ultimate mystery. It is the event that strips away all illusions of control, but also pushes us to ask what truly matters while we are alive. The paradox remains unsolved because it is not meant to be solved. It is meant to be lived with. And in living with it, we may find that death's greatest meaning lies in reminding us to value life, fragile and fleeting as it is. The paradox of the one and the many. The paradox of the one and the many is one of the oldest puzzles in philosophy, going all the way back to the earliest thinkers in ancient Greece. At its core, the paradox asks a question so simple that it seems almost too obvious. Is reality fundamentally one thing, or is it made up of many things? On the surface, the answer feels easy. We see countless things around us every day. Trees, people, animals, stars, rivers, and mountains are all separate. But at the same time, we also experience a sense of unity. Everything seems connected, part of a larger whole. The paradox is that reality appears to be both one and many at the same time, and no answer seems complete without the other. One way to think about this is through nature. Imagine a forest. When you walk through it, you see many trees. Each tree is individual, with its own trunk, branches, and leaves. But if you step back, you might see the forest not as many trees, but as one single living system. The air, the soil, the animals, the water, all work together, forming one whole. The forest is both many and one, depending on how you look at it. The paradox is that both views are true, yet they contradict each other. Philosophers like Heraclitus and Parmenides wrestled with this problem thousands of years ago. Heraclitus argued that the world is always changing, made of many things in constant motion. Parmenides, on the other hand, believed that reality is one, unchanging, and eternal, and that the variety we see is just an illusion. Later thinkers like Plato tried to bridge the gap, suggesting that the many things we see are imperfect copies of a single ideal reality. But none of these solutions fully dissolve the paradox, because the tension between the one and the many remains. In modern science, the paradox appears in surprising ways. At the smallest scale, physics shows us particles that combine to form atoms, molecules, cells, and eventually the bodies of living beings. At each level, many smaller parts combine to form a larger whole. You are one person, but you are also made of countless cells. Each cell is made of countless molecules, and those molecules are made of countless atoms. You are both many and one at the same time. At the largest scale, the universe is filled with countless galaxies, stars, and planets, yet it is also one universe. Whether you zoom in or zoom out, the paradox of the one and the many never goes away. The paradox also shapes the way we think about identity. You see yourself as one person, with a name and a history. But inside, you are made of many parts: body, mind, emotions, and memories. Even your mind itself is not a single unified thing, but a collection of thoughts, feelings, and voices that sometimes agree and sometimes conflict. Which is the real you, the one unified person, or the many parts that make you up? Both answers feel right, but they do not fit together easily. On a social level, the paradox is everywhere. A nation is one, but it is made of millions of people. A family is one, but it is made of many individuals with different personalities and desires. Humanity itself is one species, yet divided into countless cultures, languages, and histories. The paradox asks us to balance individuality with unity. How do we honor the many without losing the one, and how do we protect the one without erasing the many? Religions and spiritual traditions also wrestle with this paradox. Some teach that all beings are connected, part of a single divine reality. Others emphasize the individuality of souls and their unique journeys. Even in spiritual thought, the question remains, are we many separate sparks, or are we all part of one great flame? The paradox has no final answer, because both unity and diversity are built into the fabric of existence. On a personal level, the paradox of the one and the many can be both comforting and challenging. It reminds us that while we are individuals, we are also connected to something greater: nature, society, or the universe itself. At the same time, it warns us not to lose ourselves in the whole, because individuality also matters. Life is lived between these two truths. You are one, but you are also many, and you are part of many greater ones beyond yourself. The paradox of the one and the many shows us that reality is richer than simple categories can capture. It resists being reduced to one side or the other. Instead, it invites us to hold both together: unity and multiplicity, wholeness and parts, the single and the countless. Perhaps the paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be lived. To exist is always to be both one and many, at once a drop of water and part of the endless ocean. The paradox of the paradox. The paradox of the paradox is one of the most curious and playful puzzles in philosophy, because it asks what happens when paradoxes themselves become the subject of paradox. A paradox is usually defined as a statement or situation that seems self-contradictory yet still reveals a kind of truth. But when you think carefully, even the very idea of a paradox becomes paradoxical. If paradoxes exist, then they are unsolvable contradictions. But if they are unsolvable, how can we even describe or understand them? And if we can understand them enough to describe them, then perhaps they are not paradoxes after all. This creates a strange loop. Paradoxes are things that cannot be resolved, yet the act of naming and analyzing them is already a kind of resolution. The paradox of the paradox is that to talk about them is both possible and impossible at the same time. They exist in a space between sense and nonsense, between logic and illogic, always pulling us back and forth. For example, take the famous liar paradox. This sentence is false. If it is true, then it must be false. But if it is false, then it must be true. It is a paradox because it cannot be fully resolved. But by calling it a paradox, we are in a way giving it a solution. We put it in the category of paradoxes and stop expecting it to resolve. The paradox of the paradox is that even contradictions become stable once we accept them as paradoxes, which seems to contradict their very nature. This puzzle also highlights the limits of human logic. We build systems of reasoning to explain the world, but paradoxes reveal the cracks in those systems. They are reminders that no matter how perfect a structure of logic may appear, it will eventually face questions it cannot answer. But here lies the deeper paradox. If paradoxes reveal the limits of reason, they also become part of reason itself. They strengthen our understanding by showing us what cannot be understood. Paradoxes destroy certainty, but they also create wisdom. The paradox of the paradox can be seen in daily life as well. Sometimes, the very act of naming a problem changes the problem. When you recognize that life is full of contradictions, the contradictions lose some of their sting. You no longer expect everything to make sense, and so in a way, you find peace. But this peace is paradoxical. It comes from accepting what cannot be solved, which feels like solving it. On a symbolic level, the paradox of the paradox teaches us something about existence itself. Life is full of tensions that cannot be erased: joy and sorrow, freedom and responsibility, individuality and connection. We may try to resolve them, but often the only answer is to hold both at once. In this sense, paradox is not an exception to reality, but its very nature. To live is to live in paradox. The paradox of the paradox reminds us that the world is not neatly ordered, that contradictions are not just mistakes but part of the truth. It shows that paradoxes are not failures of logic but invitations to think more deeply, and it warns us that even the idea of paradox itself cannot escape paradox. The more we try to define or contain it, the more it slips away. In the end, the paradox of the paradox is both a puzzle and a mirror, reflecting the limits of thought, and at the same time showing us the beauty of mystery. The grandfather paradox. Time travel paradox. The grandfather paradox is one of the most famous puzzles about time travel, and it raises questions that go beyond science fiction into the very heart of logic, identity, and reality itself. The paradox begins with a simple story. Imagine you travel back in time to the period before your grandfather had children. For some reason, you interfere with his life. Perhaps you accidentally prevent him from meeting your grandmother, or in the darker version, you directly cause his death. If this happens, then your grandfather never fathers your parent, and your parent never has you. But here is the problem. If you were never born, then how could you have traveled back in time to change your grandfather's life in the first place? The paradox is that your action both creates and destroys the conditions for itself. At first, this feels like a fun puzzle for science fiction movies, but it quickly becomes a deep philosophical problem. If time travel to the past were possible, could reality even make sense? The paradox shows us that small changes in the past could unravel the very possibility of the present. If you stop your own birth, then you never travel back to stop it. But if you never travel back, then your grandfather lives, your parent is born, and so are you, which means you can travel back after all. The cycle loops endlessly, with no consistent resolution. Some thinkers try to solve the paradox with the idea of fixed timelines. In this view, if you travel into the past, your actions were already part of history all along. You might interact with your grandfather, but nothing you do can prevent your own birth, because history cannot be changed. If you threw a stone at your grandfather, perhaps he would dodge it, or some coincidence would stop you from changing anything important. The timeline is fixed, and time travel simply becomes a way of fulfilling history rather than altering it. But this solution has its own problems, because it makes free will seem like an illusion. You may believe you can change the past, but in reality, you're only acting out a script that was written all along. Others suggest a different approach, the many worlds, or parallel universe theory. In this version, when you travel to the past and interfere with events, you do not change your own timeline. Instead, you create or enter an alternate timeline. If you prevent your grandfather from having children, you simply create a universe where you do not exist. But in your original universe, your grandfather still had children, and you were born. This avoids the logical contradiction, but it leads to an even stranger thought. Every choice, every action, every possibility might create a branching timeline, leading to infinite universes. If that is true, then reality is not one single history, but a vast, endless multiverse. The grandfather paradox also forces us to think about the nature of time itself. Is time something fixed, like a line stretching from past to future, or is it something flexible, where moments can be bent, altered, or reshaped? If time can be changed, then cause and effect, the very foundation of logic, may break down. How can a cause depend on an effect, and an effect cancel its cause? If time cannot be changed, then we must accept a strange kind of determinism, where the future is already written, and our sense of freedom is just an illusion. Beyond science and philosophy, the paradox also carries symbolic meaning. The idea of killing your grandfather can represent the human desire to break free from the past, to undo mistakes, erase pain, or change the conditions that shaped us. But the paradox suggests that the past, no matter how painful, is woven into our existence in ways that cannot be undone without destroying who we are. You are here because of every choice, every accident, every twist of history that came before you. To erase part of it is to erase yourself. In this way, the grandfather paradox is less about time travel and more about acceptance. Modern stories often play with this paradox. Films and novels imagine heroes traveling to the past to change history, only to discover that their actions were the very cause of the events they tried to prevent. This loop version of the paradox creates haunting narratives where destiny seems unavoidable, even with time travel. Other stories explore the multiverse solution, imagining countless alternate realities branching off from every decision. Both approaches show how deeply the grandfather paradox captures our imagination, because it touches something fundamental in us, the wish to control time, to rewrite history, and to escape fate. In the end, the grandfather paradox remains unsolved because it may be unsolvable. It highlights the contradictions at the heart of time travel and challenges us to think about what time really is. Perhaps the paradox is not just about time machines, but about the limits of human control. We want to master the past and shape the future, but time resists us, reminding us that existence is built on fragile connections we cannot undo. The paradox leaves us with awe, frustration, and humility. Whether or not time travel is ever possible, the grandfather paradox ensures that we will always question the meaning of time, identity, and cause itself. The paradox of morality. The paradox of morality is one of those puzzles that reaches into the core of what it means to be human. Every society teaches ideas of right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. We are told that morality guides our choices, gives life meaning, and allows us to live peacefully with others. But when we look closer, morality itself becomes confusing. Is morality absolute, something fixed, universal, and unchanging? Or is it relative, shaped by culture, history, and personal perspective? If morality is absolute, then it must apply equally to everyone, everywhere, at all times. But if it is relative, then what is good in one society may be bad in another, and vice versa. The paradox lies in the fact that we often live as though morality is universal, yet we constantly see evidence that it is not. For example, consider the idea of justice. Most people believe justice is essential, But justice has meant very different things in different times. In ancient societies, slavery was considered normal and moral by many, yet today it is widely seen as one of the greatest evils. Practices like arranged marriage, capital punishment, or even rules of war have shifted drastically in moral judgment throughout history. If morality changes over time, can it truly be called universal? Yet if we claim morality is only relative, then we cannot say that things like genocide or cruelty are truly wrong. We can only say they are wrong to us. That feels unsatisfying and dangerous because it suggests morality has no firm foundation. The paradox also grows when we think about conflicts between moral rules. Take honesty and kindness, for instance. Honesty is usually considered a moral good, but what if telling the truth causes harm? If a doctor knows a patient is dying, should they be honest and tell them, or should they withhold the truth to protect them from despair? In these cases, two moral principles collide, and whichever path is chosen seems to betray morality in one form or another. This suggests morality is not a simple system, but a network of contradictions. Philosophers have tried to resolve this paradox in different ways. Some argue that morality comes from reason alone, that we can discover universal rules through logic, like Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, which says you should only act in ways that you would want everyone else to act. Others believe morality comes from consequences, that what is right or wrong depends on the results of actions, like utilitarianism, which says the moral choice is the one that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But both systems face problems. Strict universal rules can lead to harsh or absurd outcomes, while focusing only on consequences can justify cruelty if it serves a larger good. Each approach solves some problems, but creates others, and the paradox remains. On a personal level, the paradox of morality can be felt in everyday life. People often struggle between doing what feels right for themselves and what feels right for others. A person might face a choice between being loyal to a friend or being honest about the friend's mistake. They might struggle between pursuing their own happiness and sacrificing for their family. In these moments, morality does not feel like a clear guide, but like a battlefield of competing values. The paradox is that morality is supposed to give us certainty, yet it often leaves us with more questions than answers. The paradox also appears in larger global issues. Countries go to war claiming moral reasons, yet both sides believe they are in the right. Political systems clash over questions of fairness, freedom, and equality, with each side certain their moral vision is correct. If morality were truly universal and clear, why would so many people disagree so passionately about it? Perhaps morality is less about universal truth and more about human attempts to make sense of a complex, changing world. But if that is the case, then morality itself may be both real and unreal. Real, because it shapes human behavior and creates meaning. Unreal, because it may not exist outside of human minds. This is the heart of the paradox. Morality feels essential and universal, yet it may be nothing more than a creation of culture, language, and perspective. And yet, the paradox of morality is not only a problem, it is also a gift. If morality were perfectly clear, life would be mechanical. Every choice would be predetermined, with no room for growth, compassion, or struggle. Instead, the uncertainty of morality forces us to think, to empathize, and to take responsibility for our actions. The paradox teaches us that morality may not be a fixed set of rules, but an ongoing journey, a process of balancing principles, listening to others, and seeking meaning in a world that resists easy answers. In the end, the paradox of morality remains unsolved because morality itself is not fixed. It shifts with perspective, culture, and circumstance. But perhaps that is what makes it meaningful. To live morally is not to follow a simple map, but to navigate contradictions with care and courage. The paradox reminds us that morality is both impossible and essential, both relative and universal, both confusing and necessary. And it is within this tension that we discover what it means to be human. The Paradox of Sisyphus. The Paradox of Sisyphus takes its name from the ancient Greek myth of King Sisyphus, who was condemned by the gods to an eternal punishment. His fate was to roll a massive boulder up a steep hill, only to have it roll back down every time he reached the top. He would then have to walk back down, push it up again, and watch it fall forever and ever. At first glance, the story seems like a tale of cruelty from the gods, a punishment designed to break both the body and the spirit. But when philosophers look at the myth more deeply, they see something profound hidden inside. The paradox of Sisyphus is that his task is both utterly meaningless, and yet, in a strange way, it can also represent the search for meaning. Think about the punishment itself. The boulder never stays at the top. Nothing is accomplished. Sisyphus makes no progress, builds nothing lasting, and leaves behind no result. It is the perfect symbol of futility. But here is the paradox. When we compare Sisyphus's endless labor to human life, the similarities are hard to ignore. People work day after day, striving, building, and chasing goals. Yet in the end, everything we do seems temporary. We earn money only to spend it. We clean only for things to get dirty again. We work for years, only for death to wipe away our efforts. Human life, like Sisyphus's struggle, can feel like an endless cycle of pushing boulders uphill, only to watch them roll back down. This is where the paradox becomes sharp. If life is like Sisyphus's task, does that mean it is meaningless? Or is there a way to find meaning even in repetition and futility? The philosopher Albert Camus used the story of Sisyphus to describe what he called the absurd, the conflict between humanity's desire for meaning and the universe's silence. We crave purpose, order, and answers, but the world offers none. Like Sisyphus, we are trapped in a cycle without a clear goal. But Camus took this paradox and gave it a radical twist. Instead of despairing, he argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. How could Sisyphus possibly be happy? According to Camus, the answer lies in acceptance. If Sisyphus accepts his fate, if he embraces the struggle instead of waiting for it to end, then he transforms his punishment into freedom. The boulder may never stay at the top, but the act of pushing it becomes his own. He finds meaning not in the result, but in the struggle itself. This is the paradox. In a meaningless task, he can create his own meaning. And in this way, Sisyphus becomes not just a victim, but a hero. The paradox of Sisyphus speaks directly to human existence. Every person faces challenges that seem endless. We study, work, care for families, fight against difficulties, and all of it can feel repetitive. There are mornings when getting up to face another day feels like pushing a boulder up a hill. And like Sisyphus, we know the boulder will roll back down. We know there will always be another task, another problem, another struggle. But the paradox suggests that even if life offers no ultimate purpose, we can still create meaning in how we live it. The struggle itself can be enough. This idea is both terrifying and liberating. It is terrifying because it removes the illusion that life has an automatic purpose waiting for us to find. But it is liberating because it puts meaning in our hands. We do not need the gods, fate, or destiny to give us purpose. We can choose to live fully in the act of pushing, in the act of being alive, even if nothing we do lasts forever. The paradox also touches on the nature of resilience. Sisyphus does not give up, no matter how many times the boulder rolls back down. His strength is not in conquering the hill, but in refusing to be broken by the endlessness of the task. For us, this becomes a lesson in how to face life's hardships. The point is not whether we win or finish, but whether we keep going. In persistence itself, there can be dignity and meaning. Ultimately, the paradox of Sisyphus is not about a man cursed by the gods, but about the condition of being human. Life may not give us a final answer or a lasting purpose. Our efforts may seem fleeting, our achievements temporary. But the paradox reminds us that even in this, there is something profound. Meaning is not at the top of the hill, it is in the climb itself. And if we learn to embrace the struggle, to live fully in each moment of pushing, then perhaps we, like Sisyphus, can find happiness in the very place that seems most hopeless. The lottery paradox. The lottery paradox is one of those puzzles that at first seems almost playful, but the more you think about it, the more it unravels your assumptions about logic, probability, and belief. Imagine a massive lottery with millions of tickets sold. You buy one ticket. Rationally, you know your chances of winning are tiny, so small that it is reasonable to believe that your ticket will lose. In fact, it is reasonable to believe that almost every individual ticket will lose because the odds are overwhelmingly against any single one of them. And yet one ticket must win. Here lies the paradox. If it is reasonable to believe that each ticket will lose, then it is reasonable to believe that all tickets will lose. But that belief is guaranteed to be false, because at least one ticket will be the winner. How can reasoning that feels completely sound lead us to a conclusion we know cannot be true? The paradox grows sharper when we break it down step by step. Take one ticket. The chance of it losing is 99.999%. Surely it is rational to say, this ticket will not win. Now repeat that reasoning for the second ticket, the third, and so on, until you have applied it to every ticket in the lottery. Suddenly, you are left with the belief that no ticket will win. But the lottery rules guarantee that one ticket will win. Rational reasoning has led to a contradiction. The paradox is not just about lotteries. It reveals a deeper problem in how we treat probability, belief, and certainty. On one level, the lottery paradox highlights the gap between probability and truth. Something can be extremely likely without being certain. Each ticket is overwhelmingly likely to lose, but it is not true that it will lose. Our minds, however, often blur the line between probability and certainty. We treat almost certain as if it were absolutely certain. The paradox forces us to confront this mistake. It reminds us that probability is not the same as truth, and that rational belief can sometimes lead us into contradictions when we forget this distinction. The paradox also touches on the limits of rationality itself. We like to think that rational thinking always leads us to truth, but the lottery paradox shows that rational thought can create a web of beliefs that are individually reasonable but collectively false. Each step makes sense, but the whole picture collapses. This raises a disturbing question. If reason can betray us in something as simple as a lottery, how much can we trust it in the bigger questions of life, like morality, politics, science, or the meaning of existence? Philosophers and logicians have tried to resolve the paradox in different ways. Some argue that it is not actually rational to believe that a single ticket will lose, no matter how unlikely winning is. Instead, they say, you should only believe that your ticket is very likely to lose, not that it will. Others propose that rational belief must be limited. It cannot apply to every individual case in a lottery, only to the general pattern. But these solutions come at a cost. They make rational belief less flexible, less useful in daily life. After all, in everyday situations, we often act as though almost certain is the same as certain. If the weather forecast says there is a 99% chance of rain, you probably carry an umbrella without hesitation. Yet the lottery paradox warns that this habit of thinking is dangerous because it can create contradictions when scaled up. On a symbolic level, the lottery paradox also speaks to the way people think about hope, chance, and possibility. For the millions who play, the lottery is almost certain to be a loss. And yet, for one person, it is life-changing. The paradox reflects the strange human relationship with luck. We live in a world where almost everything is unlikely, yet something unlikely always happens. Life is, in a way, a lottery. Most possibilities will never occur, but one will. The paradox is that we can reasonably expect disappointment, yet we cannot dismiss the chance of extraordinary surprise. This paradox even echoes in how we think about life's meaning. Each of us is one individual among billions, with odds stacked against making a lasting impact. Rationally, it might seem safe to believe that any given person, including ourselves, will not change the world. And yet, history shows that individuals do change the world. The paradox is that while it is reasonable to assume we are ordinary, it is also guaranteed that some of us will not be. The lottery paradox in this way mirrors the uncertainty of human existence. We are all unlikely winners, but someone always wins. In the end, the lottery paradox teaches us humility about reasoning and belief. It shows that rationality is not a perfect guide, that probability and truth are not the same, and that certainty is far harder to grasp than it seems. At the same time, it reminds us of the strange beauty of chance. In a world where nearly everything is improbable, improbabilities still happen. Every day, someone draws the winning ticket. The paradox of the lottery is really the paradox of life itself. We live surrounded by unlikelihoods, yet within them lies the possibility of something extraordinary. The paradox of the infinite set. The paradox of the infinite set is one of the most mind-bending puzzles in philosophy and mathematics, because it asks us to think about something that is both familiar and impossible to fully grasp. Infinity. At first, infinity seems simple. It just means something that goes on forever, something that never ends. But when you begin to treat infinity as a real thing, as something you can compare, count, or measure, contradictions quickly appear. The paradox of the infinite set shows us that infinity does not follow the same rules as ordinary numbers, and that our normal ways of thinking about more and less break down completely when infinity is involved. Consider this example. Imagine you have an infinite set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on forever. That set is infinite. Now imagine you take away half of the numbers, such as all the even ones. Intuitively, you might think that the set would now be smaller, because you removed infinitely many numbers. But here's the paradox. The set of even numbers is still infinite, and in fact, it can be paired one-to-one with the set of all natural numbers. For every number in the original set, there is a corresponding even number. 1 pairs with 2, 2 pairs with 4, 3 pairs with 6, and so on. Both sets are the same size, even though one is a subset of the other. This defies our normal understanding of quantity. In the world of infinity, a part can be equal to the whole. This paradox was explored in depth by the mathematician Georg Cantor in the 19th century, who shocked the world by showing that not all infinities are equal. Some infinities are bigger than others. For example, the set of real numbers, which includes fractions and decimals, is larger than the set of natural numbers. Both are infinite, but one infinity is a higher order than the other. This idea sounds impossible, but it's and be proven with careful logic. Infinity, which at first seemed like a single concept, turns out to be a vast hierarchy of different infinities, stretching endlessly upward. The paradox of the infinite set is that infinity is both one and many, both uncountable and measurable, both endless and yet ordered. One of the clearest illustrations of this paradox is known as Hilbert's Hotel. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all filled with guests. At first you might think the hotel is completely full. But if a new guest arrives, the manager can still make space by moving the person in room 1 to room 2, the person in room 2 to room 3, and so on forever. This opens up room 1 for the new guest. In fact, no matter how many new guests arrive, even an infinite number of them, the hotel can always accommodate them by shifting the guests around. The paradox here is that a hotel that is full can still take in more guests, as long as it is infinite. Infinity breaks every rule of ordinary reasoning. Beyond mathematics, the paradox of the infinite set raises questions about the universe itself. Is space infinite? Is time infinite? If the universe stretches forever, then does it contain infinite stars, infinite planets, infinite possibilities? If time is infinite, then does every possible event happen eventually? These questions reveal why infinity is not just a mathematical curiosity, but a deep philosophical problem. If infinity is real, then the universe might contain not only everything that exists, but everything that could possibly exist. And if everything happens somewhere or somewhen, then what does it mean to talk about uniqueness, choice, or chance? The paradox also touches on the nature of human thought. Our minds are built to handle finite things, countable, measurable, limited. Infinity overwhelms us because it is something we can describe but never truly imagine. We can write down the symbol for infinity, but we cannot picture it. It is a concept always beyond our reach. And yet infinity appears in so many areas of life. In mathematics, in cosmology, in theology, even in art and imagination. It is both the simplest idea, something without end, and the most complex. The paradox of the infinite. Set challenges us to rethink what we mean by more and less, whole and part. It shows that infinity does not obey the rules of the finite world. A subset can equal the whole, and two infinities can be different sizes. It teaches us that logic, when pushed far enough, can lead us to strange and unsettling truths. Infinity is not just a number, it is a mirror held up to the limits of human reason. In the end, the paradox of the infinite set leaves us with a mix of wonder and unease. It shows us that some concepts will always stretch beyond our grasp, that the universe may be stranger than we can comprehend, and that the infinite is both a simple idea and an endless mystery. It is a reminder that not everything in reality can be neatly measured or understood. Sometimes the more we try to define infinity, the more infinite it becomes. The paradox of identity. Over time. The paradox of identity. Over time asks one of the most unsettling questions about human existence. How can a person remain the same individual throughout their life, even though everything about them changes? From the moment you are born until the day you die, your body, your thoughts, your memories, and even your personality shift and evolve. You are not the same baby you once were, and one day you will not be the same old person you may become. Yet somehow we insist that all of these versions, baby, teenager, adult, elder, are the same person, you. The paradox lies in the tension between continuity and change. If everything about you changes, in what sense are you still the same? One way to see this paradox clearly is to think of physical change. The human body is not a fixed object, but a dynamic system. Scientists tell us that almost every cell in your body is replaced over time. Your skin renews every few weeks, your blood cells every few months, and even your bones, hard and solid as they seem, are replaced every decade or so. In a very real sense, the body you have now is not the same body you had 10 years ago. If your body is constantly renewing itself, are you still the same physical person you were then? The paradox grows sharper when we consider the mind. Memories fade, shift, or even disappear. Personality traits change with age and experience. A person who was shy as a child may grow bold as an adult. A person who loved one set of values in youth may reject them in old age. If your mind, your beliefs, and your memories define who you are, then who are you when those things change? Are you still the same self? Or are you, in some sense, a series of different selves connected by a fragile thread? Philosophers have tried to answer this puzzle in different ways. Some argue that identity comes from continuity of memory. You are the same person if you remember your past experiences. But this solution quickly runs into problems. What about forgotten memories? Are you no longer the person who had them? What about when people suffer memory loss from injury or illness? Do they stop being themselves? Others argue that identity comes from the continuity of the body or the brain. As long as the physical organism continues, the person remains the same. But this also has problems. If the body is always changing, or if technology one day allows a brain to be uploaded into a machine, would the self still be continuous? The paradox of identity over time also connects to thought experiments. Imagine a person who undergoes gradual replacement of their body with artificial parts, first a hand, then a leg, then an organ, and eventually the brain. At what point does the person stop being themselves, or do they remain the same all along? Another famous example is the Ship of Theseus, which asks if a ship remains the same when all its parts are replaced. Applied to people, the paradox asks, if every part of you changes, what anchors your identity? In everyday life, we live with this paradox without noticing it. You call yourself the same person you were as a child, even though almost nothing about you remains the same. You hold yourself responsible for promises made years ago, even though your present self might feel differently. Society, law, and morality all depend on the idea that identity endures over time. If identity were not continuous, we could not hold someone accountable for crimes committed years earlier, nor could we celebrate achievements made by our younger selves. Yet beneath this practical assumption lies the paradox. The person who made those choices in the past is not exactly the same as the person you are now. On a symbolic level, the paradox of identity over time reveals something about human existence itself. Life is not static, but a river of change. To live is to transform constantly, to shed old selves and grow new ones. Yet within this river, we cling to the idea of a self that endures. Perhaps identity is not a fixed object, but a story, a narrative that ties together all the shifting parts. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, but you are part of the same unfolding story. The paradox is that identity may not be a thing but a process, a thread of continuity woven through endless change. This paradox also forces us to think about mortality. If your identity is built on constant change, then death might not be an abrupt ending, but simply the final transformation, the moment when the thread comes to its conclusion. In this way, the paradox of identity over time reminds us of both our fragility and our strength. Fragility, because nothing about us is fixed. Strength, because even through endless change, we still manage to call ourselves one and the same. In the end, the paradox of identity over time leaves us with no simple answer. We are both the same and not the same as we were in the past. We are both one person and many different versions of that person. Identity is both solid and fragile, both continuous and ever-changing. The paradox is not something to solve, but something to live. To recognize that who you are is always in motion, yet always, somehow, still you. The paradox of the mirror. The paradox of the mirror begins with a familiar experience, looking into your reflection. Every day, people face mirrors to check their appearance, adjust their hair, or confirm how others might see them. At first glance, the mirror seems to show the truth. It reflects exactly what stands in front of it. But when you think more deeply, mirrors raise unsettling questions about identity, perception, and reality itself. The paradox of the mirror is that it both reveals and hides who we are. It shows us an image that feels like ourselves, but is not us, and it confronts us with the tension between appearance and reality. Consider the simple fact that a mirror reverses left and right. When you raise your right hand, the mirror shows your reflection raising its left hand. If you tilt your head one way, the reflection tilts the other. This creates the strange impression that you are looking at another being, one that mimics you perfectly but in reverse. It is both you and not you. The paradox emerges because the mirror claims to reveal truth while also presenting a distorted version of it. What you see is a likeness, but it is not the same as how others see you in real life. You never actually see yourself as others do. You only ever see your mirror image, flipped and flattened. This means that the you recognize most closely is not the true you at all, but an illusion produced by glass. The paradox deepens when we think about what the reflection represents. A mirror shows the outside of a person, the physical surface, but it cannot show the inner self. It reflects the face, but not the thoughts behind it, the body, but not the consciousness. When you look into a mirror, you recognize the reflection as yourself, but you also know it lacks everything that makes you truly you, your mind, your memories, your feelings. This creates a haunting tension. The mirror shows you both too much and too little. It gives you a perfect copy of your appearance, yet it withholds the essence of your identity. Psychologists and philosophers have long been fascinated by the role mirrors play in human self-awareness. Infants, for example, do not recognize themselves in a mirror until a certain stage of development. When they finally do, it marks the beginning of self-consciousness, the awareness that I exist as an object in the world. But here lies the paradox again. To recognize yourself in a mirror is to recognize yourself as both subject and object. You are the one who sees, and you are also the one who is seen. The self becomes split, the living I and the reflected me. Which one is the real you? The paradox of the mirror also appears in literature and art, where mirrors often symbolize truth, illusion, or hidden realities. In fairy tales, mirrors are portals to other worlds or tools that reveal secrets. In psychology, mirrors can be unsettling, as in the phenomenon of the uncanny, the eerie feeling of seeing something that is both familiar and strange. When you stare at your reflection for too long, it can begin to feel alien, as if you are looking at someone else entirely. The paradox is that the reflection is both the closest thing to you and the farthest thing from you, a constant reminder of the mystery of selfhood. On a deeper level, the paradox of the mirror reflects the human struggle with identity itself. Who are you really? The person others see? The person you see in the mirror? Or the invisible mind behind it all? The mirror raises these questions every time you glance at it. It shows a self that is physical and visible, but your true self may be something that can never be seen, an inner experience that no reflection can capture. The paradox is that the more you try to see yourself, the more you confront the impossibility of fully seeing who you are. In modern times, the paradox of the mirror has become even sharper with photography, cameras, and social media. Today, people see themselves more often in pictures and videos than in real mirrors. But the same problem remains. These images show an external version of you, not the whole truth. They are filtered, edited, reversed, or frozen in time. They create an identity that feels real, but may not match the inner reality. Once again, the self is split between how we appear and who we are, between the reflection and the being reflected. Ultimately, the paradox of the mirror is not about glass and reflections, but about the mystery of selfhood. It reminds us that we are always both subject and object, both seer and seen. It shows us that identity cannot be reduced to an image, yet we constantly seek ourselves in images. The paradox is that the mirror feels like the truest way to see ourselves, but it is also the most deceptive. We are more than what any mirror can reflect, yet without mirrors, we might never have learned to see ourselves at all. In the end, the paradox of the mirror leaves us with a haunting thought. Perhaps the self is always a reflection, always something glimpsed but never fully grasped. Just as the mirror gives us a reversed image, life itself may always give us only partial views of who we are. The mirror is both a tool of recognition and a reminder of the impossibility of complete self-knowledge. To live with the paradox of the mirror is to accept that we are both what we see and what we cannot see, an endless mystery staring back at us through the glass. The paradox of the perfect life. The paradox of the perfect life asks a question that lies at the heart of human desire. What would it mean to live a life that is truly perfect? At first, the idea sounds wonderful. Imagine a life where everything goes right, where you have health, happiness, love, success, security, and joy without interruption. No pain, no loss, no disappointment, no struggle. A life of endless peace and fulfillment. Surely this is the ultimate dream. And yet, when we think carefully about it, the very idea of a perfect life collapses into a paradox. The paradox is that the conditions that make life feel meaningful, struggle, growth, contrast, and imperfection, would disappear in a perfect life, leaving behind something that might not feel like life at all. Consider how we normally measure happiness. Often it comes from overcoming obstacles, from achieving something after effort, or from finding light after darkness. Joy feels sweetest when it follows sorrow. Success feels most valuable when it comes after failure. If everything were always perfect, these contrasts would vanish. Pleasure without pain would no longer feel like pleasure. It would just be normal. Achievements without struggle would feel empty, because nothing would be gained that wasn't already guaranteed. A perfect life stripped of hardship might paradoxically become boring, hollow, or meaningless. This paradox is captured in countless stories and myths. In some tales, mortals wish for eternal happiness, only to find it unbearable once granted. The absence of challenge or suffering leads to a sense of stagnation. Without death, life loses urgency. Without sorrow, joy loses depth. Without struggle, triumph loses meaning. The paradox is that what we think of as perfection may actually destroy the very conditions that make life valuable. In chasing a perfect life, we risk creating a life that feels lifeless. Philosophers and psychologists alike have wrestled with this paradox. Some argue that perfection is impossible, precisely because human beings are creatures of contrast. Our minds are wired to notice differences, to measure experiences against one another. Happiness exists only in relation to unhappiness, satisfaction only in relation to desire. If every moment were equally good, nothing would stand out. A life of endless perfection might flatten into monotony. The paradox is that imperfection itself is what makes perfection meaningful. On a personal level, the paradox of the perfect life appears in everyday goals. People often dream of a life where nothing goes wrong, no stress, no heartbreak, no failures. But many who have experienced ease and abundance discover that comfort alone does not bring fulfillment. Often people find their deepest sense of meaning in moments of hardship, caring for others in times of illness, learning from mistakes, or growing stronger after loss. These are not perfect moments, but they shape us into who we are. The paradox is that imperfection is not the opposite of a good life, but the very foundation of it. The paradox also appears in society's pursuit of perfection. Advertisements promise the perfect body, the perfect career, the perfect relationship. Technology promises to remove struggle, making everything effortless. Yet the more we chase these ideals, the more dissatisfaction grows. Perfection recedes like a horizon, always just out of reach. And even if we reached it, would it satisfy us? Or would we, like Sisyphus, feel trapped in endless repetition without challenge? In a spiritual or symbolic sense, the paradox of the perfect life reflects humanity's longing for paradise. Many traditions imagine a state of eternal peace or bliss beyond suffering. But even these visions face the paradox. If paradise contains no change, no striving, and no contrast, can it truly feel alive? Some religious thinkers have suggested that paradise must contain growth, creativity, or discovery to remain meaningful. Otherwise, perfection becomes static, and life loses its spark. Ultimately, the paradox of the perfect life teaches us that perfection is not found in the absence of flaws, but in the balance of them. A life without pain would erase the meaning of joy. A life without death would erase the urgency of love. A life without obstacles would erase the triumph of overcoming them. Perfection, if it exists, may not mean a flawless life, but a life that embraces both light and shadow, struggle and peace, sorrow and joy. The paradox leaves us with a profound lesson. Perhaps the perfect life is not one without imperfection, but one in which imperfection itself is part of the beauty. To be human is to live in contrast, to grow through challenge, and to find meaning in a world that is never complete. The dream of a perfect life tempts us, but the paradox reminds us that what we truly need may not be perfection at all, but the richness of imperfection. The paradox of the infinite mind. The paradox of the infinite mind is one of the most fascinating and unsettling puzzles in philosophy, because it asks us to imagine a mind without limits, a consciousness capable of knowing everything, understanding everything, and remembering everything. At first, this seems like the ultimate form of perfection. A mind that is never confused, never ignorant, never forgetful. Such a mind would be like that of a god, limitless in power and awareness. But when we think more carefully about what such a mind would be like, contradictions begin to emerge. The paradox is that an infinite mind might not be meaningful, useful, or even possible, because the very qualities that make thought valuable, curiosity, discovery, and growth, would vanish if a mind already contained all knowledge. Imagine for a moment that you had infinite knowledge. You would know every language, every fact of history, every detail of science, every secret of the universe. You would also know the outcome of every choice you could ever make, and you would remember every single moment of your life without forgetting anything. At first, this might sound exhilarating, but then the paradox sets in. If you already know everything, then there is nothing left to learn. Curiosity would disappear because curiosity depends on not knowing. Discovery would vanish because discovery depends on uncovering the unknown. Growth would become impossible because growth depends on change and learning. An infinite mind, rather than being the greatest mind, might instead be a static, lifeless existence. The paradox becomes sharper when we think about memory. Human beings forget constantly, and though it often feels like a weakness, forgetting is essential. If you remembered every detail of every moment, your mind would be overwhelmed. Memory must filter, choose, and discard in order to remain useful. An infinite memory would drown you in information, leaving you unable to focus on what matters. In this way, the very act of forgetting, which seems like a flaw, turns out to be a strength. The paradox of the infinite mind is that limits, rather than being obstacles, may actually be what make thought possible. This puzzle also raises questions about free will. If an infinite mind already knows everything, including the future, then what room is left for choice? If you know exactly what you will decide tomorrow, can you truly choose differently? If an infinite mind knows every detail of every possible path, then the experience of decision, of uncertainty, and of freedom disappears. The paradox is that the very act of thinking depends on limits, on not knowing everything at once. Without limits, the mind ceases to function as a mind. Philosophers and theologians have long grappled with this paradox when thinking about divine intelligence. Many traditions describe God as omniscient, all-knowing, infinite in wisdom. But how does an infinite mind experience the world? Can such a mind be surprised, curious, or creative? If everything is already known, then nothing is new. Yet, at the same time, many people believe that creativity, curiosity, and love are essential parts of intelligence. The paradox is that an infinite mind, by knowing everything, might lose the very qualities that make mind meaningful. On a human level, the paradox of the infinite mind reflects our own relationship with knowledge. We live in an age where information is more accessible than ever before. The internet places vast amounts of data at our fingertips, and artificial intelligence systems can process it faster than we can imagine. But as information grows, people often feel more overwhelmed, not more enlightened. More knowledge does not always bring more wisdom. Sometimes it brings confusion, anxiety, or paralysis. This mirrors the paradox of the infinite mind. Too much knowledge can become as limiting as too little. Symbolically, the paradox of the infinite mind teaches us something profound about human life. We often think that perfection would mean having no limits, but perhaps the truth is the opposite. Limits give shape to meaning. The fact that we do not know everything makes discovery thrilling. The fact that we forget makes memory precious. The fact that we face uncertainty makes freedom possible. The paradox is that imperfection is not the opposite of intelligence, but the very condition for it. In the end, the paradox of the infinite mind leaves us with a humbling realization. To be finite is not a weakness, but a gift. Our minds are valuable not because they know everything, but because they strive, grow, and change. An infinite mind may sound like perfection, but it may also be emptiness, an endless sea of knowledge with no waves of discovery. The paradox reminds us that intelligence, curiosity, and wisdom exist not in infinity, but in limitation. The beauty of thought lies not in knowing all answers, but in the endless search for them. The paradox of the first cause. The paradox of the first cause is one of the oldest and most profound puzzles in philosophy, religion, and science. It begins with a question that seems simple, but quickly becomes overwhelming. If everything in the universe has a cause, what was the very first cause? In everyday experience, nothing happens without a reason. A tree grows because a seed was planted, the seed existed because of another tree, and that tree grew because of yet another seed. Every effect has a cause. Every event follows from something before it. But if we follow this chain backward, it cannot go on forever. Or can it? If it does not go on forever, then there must have been a first cause, something that started the chain. Yet if there was a first cause, what caused it? The paradox is that the idea of a first cause seems both necessary and impossible at the same time. Philosophers in ancient Greece wrestled with this problem. Aristotle spoke of a prime mover, an unmoved mover that set the universe into motion but was itself beyond movement. Centuries later, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish theologians took up similar arguments, describing God as the first cause, the being that brought everything into existence without needing a cause itself. But this explanation leads directly into the paradox. If everything requires a cause, why should God, or any first cause, be exempt? To say that something must exist without a cause seems to break the very principle we began with, that everything has a cause. And yet, without such an exception, the chain of causes stretches infinitely backward, never reaching a beginning. The idea of an infinite regress, that causes go back forever, is itself paradoxical. Human minds struggle to imagine infinity, especially when it comes to time. If the universe had no beginning, if events stretch backward without end, how did we ever arrive at Terra? He present moment? How can an infinite chain of causes already be completed? It feels impossible, yet the alternative, a first cause that came from nothing, feels equally impossible. This is the heart of the paradox. Both options seem to contradict logic, yet one of them must be true. Modern science has not solved the paradox, though it has given it new forms. Cosmology tells us that the universe began with the Big Bang, a massive explosion about 13.8 billion years ago. But what caused the Big Bang? Some theories suggest quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, but then we must ask, what caused the quantum vacuum? Others suggest that universes may arise endlessly, one after another, in a multiverse. But then we face the same problem. What caused the first universe in that infinite chain? No matter how far science goes, the question of the first cause lingers, like a horizon that always recedes as we approach it. The paradox of the first cause also reaches into human attempts to understand existence itself. When people ask, why is there something rather than nothing, they are pointing to this very puzzle. If everything needs an explanation, then the existence of the universe must have one too. But what could explain existence itself? Any explanation seems to require something beyond existence, which feels impossible. The paradox suggests that the ultimate foundation of reality might lie beyond human logic entirely. On a symbolic level, the paradox of the first cause reflects our search for origins in all areas of life. We ask where we came from, who our ancestors were, how the world began, how life started. Every origin story, whether scientific or religious, eventually comes to a stopping point, a place where we must simply say, it began here. But that stopping point always carries a hidden contradiction. It leaves us wondering what came before. Whether we speak of gods, quantum fields, or eternal universes, the paradox remains the same. Some philosophers embrace the paradox rather than trying to escape it. They suggest that perhaps not everything needs a cause, or that our human logic is not equipped to handle ultimate questions. Others propose that time itself may be an illusion, that the question of a first cause only exists because we imagine time as a linear chain. If time is cyclical, or if it is a human construction, then perhaps the paradox dissolves. But these ideas are themselves paradoxical, because they require us to rethink the very foundations of reason. In the end, the paradox of the first cause reminds us of the limits of human understanding. We live in a world where causes and effects seem obvious, yet when we trace them far enough, the very structure of logic collapses. The paradox leaves us with awe and humility. It tells us that existence itself is a mystery we may never fully solve, and that the ultimate origin of all things may lie beyond cause and effect, beyond time and space. Whether we call it God, the universe, or the uncaused cause, the paradox remains. Everything has a reason, and yet the reason for everything cannot be found. The paradox of the forgotten past. The paradox of the forgotten past invites us to reflect on one of the most mysterious aspects of human existence, memory, and more importantly, its absence. Every one of us carries a past, a story of where we came from, what we have experienced, and who we once were. This past shapes our identity and influences every choice we make. Yet much of it, perhaps even most of it, is forgotten. We do not remember being infants, though those early years formed the foundation of our personalities. We forget countless days, faces, conversations and feelings as though they never happened. And yet they did happen. They left traces, shaping who we are, even if we cannot recall them. The paradox is that our past defines us, and at the same time it slips away from us. We are shaped by what we no longer remember. Consider the strange fact that you were once a baby, unable to speak, unable to think in the way you do now. That baby was you, yet you cannot recall a single moment of its life. You have no conscious memory of learning to walk, of hearing language for the first time, or of the early impressions that laid the groundwork for your personality. Does this mean that the baby was a different person? Or are you the same person, even though your memories of that time are gone? The paradox lies in the tension. You are continuous with your past self, but you do not know your past self. Identity depends on memory, but memory is incomplete. The paradox grows deeper when we think about forgotten experiences later in life. Every day, countless moments slip away. We might not remember the details of an ordinary Tuesday 5 years ago, but the choices we made that day shaped the course of our lives. Forgotten friends, forgotten places, forgotten lessons, all still exist in the hidden architecture of who we are. The paradox is that the forgotten past is both gone and present at once. It is lost to conscious memory, yet it continues to shape the unconscious mind, influencing our habits, fears, desires, and choices. Psychology shows us just how powerful the forgotten past can be. Traumas that we no longer recall can still affect our behavior, surfacing in subtle ways. Childhood experiences we cannot remember continue to echo in how we form relationships or respond to stress. Even things as small as forgotten smells, songs, or sights can trigger feelings that seem to come from nowhere. The paradox is that forgetting does not erase, it only hides. The past we forget is still alive in us, invisible but influential. This paradox also touches on the mystery of history itself. Just as individuals forget their personal past, societies forget their collective past. Whole cultures lose memories of ancient traditions, languages, or events. Some of these forgotten histories resurface through archaeology or storytelling, while others vanish forever. Yet even when forgotten, the past shapes the present. The structures of cities, the customs of people, the hidden roots of conflicts, all come from histories that are often unknown to those living in their shadow. The paradox is that we are always living the consequences of what we cannot remember. Philosophers have long connected memory to identity. John Locke argued that personal identity depends on memory. You are the same person as your past self, because you can remember being that self. But the paradox of the forgotten past challenges this view. If identity depends on memory, then do forgotten memories erase parts of our identity? Are we still the same person as the baby we cannot recall, or as the teenager whose thoughts we no longer recognize? If we are not, then who are we? And if we are, then what anchors that identity, if not memory? The paradox of the forgotten past also has a spiritual dimension. Some traditions teach that forgetting is essential to living. If we carried every detail of our past consciously, we might collapse under the weight of memory. Forgetting gives us room to grow, to let go, to change. But at the same time, forgetting feels like loss, a vanishing of moments that once mattered deeply. Every laugh, every conversation, every embrace eventually dissolves into silence. Yet even in silence, the past lingers in the way we love, the way we hope, the way we fear. On a symbolic level, the paradox of the forgotten past suggests that life is both a presence and an absence. We are never just who we are right now. We are also who we once were, even if we cannot see or remember it. The forgotten past is like an invisible companion, always with us, always shaping us, even as it escapes our grasp. In the end, the paradox of the forgotten past leaves us with a haunting realization. Memory is not the full record of who we are, but only fragments of a much larger story. The past is never fully gone, nor fully present. It exists in a strange in-between. We are creatures of memory, but we are also creatures of forgetting. The paradox is that we cannot know our full selves, because much of what makes us who we are is hidden from us. And yet, perhaps it is what gives life its mystery. The sense that we are always more than we can remember, more than we can see, more than we can know.